You seem quite reserved tonight. What?
I've been studying UFOs. Did you know there are UFOs out here flying around, unidentified objects?
This would be the place for them, Southern California.
I'm serious. They sighted a bunch over Georgia. I've seen them at night. They have real photos of them, and the government and the people just completely seem like don't talk about it. But Mr. Harold Salkin of Washington, D.C., he's the head of the National UFO Bureau.
Right.
He brought me moving films. I actually have moving pictures of low salt.
A protest of people, by people, who want more information about UFOs. This is Operation Right to Know. When I first saw this, I thought it was another gay rights march in D.C., and then I looked closer and found out that it could have been
The godmother of your daughter, Shirley MacLaine, writes in her new book that you sighted a UFO over her home in Washington State. Did you see a UFO?
I did, and the rest of the account, well, I didn't, it was unidentified flying object.
Pilots, investigators, scientists, and researchers from 7 different countries gathered in Washington to discuss their shared experiences about UFOs.
This is amazing. And you know what? I can't help but laugh about this because when you think of people saying, "Oh, hey, I saw a UFO," you kind of think of freaks. I'm not going to lie.
I think that there is absolutely has been visitors from other places on this planet.
Visitors from like not on this planet to this aliens?
Numerous senior pilots from the Navy have been reporting significant UFO activity.
You take questions on UFOs, Admiral?
There's a reporting process for that and an office that handles that.
President Obama says that there is footage and records of objects in the skies, these unidentified aerial phenomenon, and he says we don't know exactly what they are. What do you think that it is?
I would ask him again. Thank you. Come on, boss, let's go.
With UFOs, there exists a culture of stigma and ridicule, and many people will instinctively scoff and sneer at UFOs despite growing interest in efforts to destigmatize the subject from major institutions like NASA, the United States Navy, and Congress. And reducing this stigma was one of the major themes of the first congressional UFO hearings held in over 50 years.
We also understand that there has been a cultural stigma surrounding UAP. Our goal is to eliminate the stigma by fully incorporating our operators and mission personnel into a standardized data gathering process.
The stigma associated with UAPs has gotten in the way of good intelligence analysis. Pilots avoided reporting or were laughed at when they did.
So how does this happen? Why do so many people scoff or sneer when UFOs are mentioned? Why is there a stigma? It was by design. In the years following World War II, various factions within the American government initiated a cover-up, which quickly evolved into a full-blown psychological operation to demystify UFOs in the eyes of the American people. The United States Department of Defense has defined a psychological operation, or PSYOP, as an operation to convey selected information and indicators to foreign audiences to influence their emotions, motives, objective reasoning, and ultimately, the behavior of foreign governments, organizations, groups, and individuals. The purpose of psychological operations is to induce or reinforce foreign attitudes and behavior favorable to the originator's objectives. And there is documented evidence that the Air Force, the intelligence community, and the media have conspired in conducting a psychological operation against the American people to shape public opinion on UFOs. Various actions have been taken to control the UFO narrative, some to increase secrecy, some to increase ridicule, some to obfuscate, and others to deceive. Each of these different components of the anti-UFO PSYOP would have their own effect on public opinion. But they would be most effective when these differing components worked together and when they were broadcast by controlled media. And as a result, an environment was created where pilots do not report their UFO sightings, scientists and journalists do not engage with the topic, and people will laugh at the subject. even if they have done no research. In this video, we will try and explain the stigma by covering the creation and the implementation of the psyop that made society dismiss UFOs. To best illustrate this, we will go back to the beginning of the flying saucer era, when the foundations of secrecy, stigma, and ridicule were laid, and study the Air Force, the intelligence community, and the media, the ways that they interacted with each other, and the ways that they conspired in shaping the public's perceptions of UFOs. Deconstructing an entire psychological operation is a big task. We will cover many names, dates, events, and documents, and a lot of these topics will be covered in greater depth in later videos. But it is important to see all of this information together to have an encompassing view of this history. And if we want to get rid of the UFO stigma, we need to understand the mechanisms that created it. Some sources and further reading on this subject can be found in the books The Missing Times, News Media Complicity in the UFO Cover-Up by Terry Hansen, Silver Screen Saucers, Sorting Fact from Fantasy in Hollywood's UFO Movies by Robbie Graham, Mirage Men by Mark Pilkington, UFOs and the National Security State by Richard Dolan, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Edward J. Ruppelt, the blog The Saucers That Time Forgot by Curt Collins and Claude Falkstrom, the blog Saturday Night Uforia, and the Reddit post of user MKUltra Escapee. These and other reference documents are linked in the description. Behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are soberly concerned about UFOs. But through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe the unknown flying objects are nonsense. Admiral Roscoe H. Hillenkotter, the first director of the CIA. Following a wave of UFO reports in 1947, the United States Air Force officially began investigating UFOs with Project Sign. Project Sign's main goal was to determine if the flying saucer phenomena was a threat to national security. Project Sign was given a security classification of restricted, beginning the culture of secrecy with UFOs. Internally, Project Sign was full of people genuinely wanting to solve the saucer mystery. Most of the cases they investigated could be identified, but some were quite anomalous and could not be explained. One example, Holloman Air Force Base, 1948. Multiple witnesses described two glowing orbs, 35 meters in diameter, seemingly intelligently controlled. And these glowing fireballs were being seen at high-security military installations all over the country, like the White Sands Missile Range and Oak Ridge. Among the Project Sign staff, there were many factions representing many hypotheses of what the saucers were, ranging from Soviet craft and even to extraterrestrial craft. Although internally the Project Sign staff was exploring all possibilities, this was never revealed to the public, and the Air Force would try to not engage the media about their investigations. If the media persisted, it was common for the Project Sign staff to lie to the press and positively identify unknown cases as balloons, even if there was testimony from credible witnesses. From the beginning, deceit was involved, though at first only if the media persisted. Early on, civilian scientists were consulted to be scientific advisors, like Dr. Lincoln LaPace and Dr. J. Allen Hynek, both famous astronomers. J. Allen Hynek claimed that even during the Project Sign days, the Air Force expected him to debunk cases he was not certain of. But for the most part, during this time, the motto was to not engage media. Some of the science staff were leaning more and more into otherworldly explanations for flying saucers, but top Air Force brass did not like this. There was a showdown between the science staff and the Pentagon about how open to be with the public, and the Pentagon won. a sanitized version of the Project Sign report was released to the public in February of 1949. The report stated, most saucers were misidentifications and hoaxes, but it did include some open-endedness. Quote, no definitive and conclusive evidence is yet available that would prove or disprove the existence of these unidentified objects as real craft of unknown and unconventional configuration. It is unlikely that positive proof of their existence will be obtained without examination of the remains of crashed objects. This open-endedness about potential remains of crashed objects spurred on saucer articles and stories throughout the country. Top Air Force brass did not like the public conclusions of Project Sign and the subsequent media generated. Project Sign was reorganized into Project Grudge, with the hope of alleviating public anxiety over UFOs. Many of the Project Sign personnel that had supported the extraterrestrial hypothesis were transferred out or resigned, and a new batch of people would join the Air Force investigations. There was an abrupt change in policy, with a greater emphasis on silence with the media and on explaining flying saucer reports away with prosaic explanations. And with Project Grudge, we see the Air Force's first attempts at influencing public opinion beyond official press releases. What You Can Believe About Flying Saucers was the title of a series of articles in the Saturday Evening Post in April of 1949. These articles are significant because they were ghostwritten by the Air Force, but made to look as though they had not been. The ghostwritten articles stated that most flying saucers were misidentifications and hoaxes. But what makes this article significant is that it included statements from General Hoyt S. Vandenberg, General Curtis E. LeMay, and Colonel Howard McCoy, all huge names in the Air Force. They had been largely silent, but this lucky reporter from the Saturday Evening Post got the first look behind the scenes. And when Vandenberg, LeMay, and McCoy finally spoke, these top Air Force brass repeated the official stance of hoaxes and misidentifications. To many Americans who had been casually paying attention to the flying saucer phenomena, this was the first time the Air Force had a unified national stance. The Air Force was no longer staying silent. They were proclaiming flying saucers were nothing but hoaxes and misidentifications. The Saturday Evening Post articles are also important because they contain language like the Great Flying Saucer Scare, rich, full-blown screwiness, and fearsome freaks, meant to stigmatize UFOs and those that report them. To the public, these stigmatizing remarks appearing alongside the likes of Vandenberg, LeMay, and McCoy imply that the Air Force was co-signing this stigmatizing attitude. And today, with hindsight, we know that these words were actually written by the Air Force. These articles show that as far back as 1949, the Air Force was using appeals to authority, stigma, and ridicule to shape public opinion on UFOs. Project Grudge issued one public report in August of 1949, which concluded that there is no evidence that UFOs were advanced foreign development and that UFOs constitute no threat to national security. Most UFOs were misidentifications and hoaxes. A much firmer stance than Project Sign. Most Americans believed the Project Grudge conclusions in the Saturday Evening Post articles, as the public's faith in institutions was at an all-time high following World War II. And these appeals to authority on larger platforms caused many to dismiss UFOs early on. There was a small but growing group of people, however, who were starting to question the official Air Force narrative, largely spurred on by flying saucer articles in magazines written by people like Donald Kehoe and Frank Scully. At this time, there was also a growing skeptic community. Among the Americans that were still interested in flying saucers, there was a healthy spirit of debate about what was causing the flying saucer phenomena. Even President Truman was quoted as saying he was just as puzzled as the next fellow by the latest flurry of reports about weird and wonderful sights in April of 1950. Along with the magazines and a few books, flying saucers were starting to make their way onto the silver screen, a new problem for the Air Force. During this time, the Air Force was no stranger to cinema, being more than happy to lend technical support to films that portrayed the Air Force in a good light. In the post-war years, a string of films were made with the Air Force, showing off the feats of airmen and America, and shaping perceptions of this new military branch. However, when it came to flying saucer cinema, the Air Force relationship was quite bizarre. let's look at how the Air Force reacted to the first flying saucer movies. 1950s, The Flying Saucer would be the first ever film to deal with the subject of UFOs. And in an effort to garner interest, the film's director, Mikhail Conrad, lied to a newspaper stating the film contained real footage of flying saucers. This single news article launched a multi-month Air Force investigation, resulting with OSI agents from the Los Angeles field office locating Mikhail Conrad, receiving a private screening of the film, and recording an apology from the director. This investigation is interesting. If flying saucers are hoaxes, why does it matter if someone claims to have footage of one? 1950 also introduced the first UFO mini-documentary, The Flying Saucer Mystery.
The strange discs have been reported by sober Americans since 1947. Just what did these people see?
The Air Force did not make the documentary, but their perspective was represented, and the conclusions of the documentary were that saucers were most likely Navy craft. In 1951, the Air Force received offers to participate in the films The Day the Earth Stood Still and The Thing from Another World. The Air Force declined these offers, and in a meeting with Hollywood producers, Air Force officers were quoted as saying, "We just spent millions of dollars debunking flying saucers. Why would we help you make a movie about them?" For now, it was just a few ghostwritten articles and papers, and in January of 1951, the Air Force would ghostwrite their next article, The Disgraceful Flying Saucer Hoax, in Cosmopolitan magazine. This time, the ridicule was not just featured near Air Force personnel, but coming directly from them. Colonel Harold Watson, who oversaw Project Grudge, was quoted in the article as saying, "At the end of nearly every report tracked down stands a crackpot, a religious crank, a publicity hound, or a malicious practical joker." And of Frank Scully, one of the first UFO researchers like Donald Kehoe, Colonel Watson said, "His book made me slightly ill after 15 pages." The project-signed days of respectfully and discreetly disagreeing with witnesses were gone. Now Air Force public policy was ridicule. At the turn of the decade, the American public's attention began to shift focus to the Korean War, and interest in flying saucers was dropping. The Air Force was only averaging about 10 new cases a month, nothing close to the initial wave of 1947. Around this time, there was another small reorganization of Project Grudge. And this is when Edward Ruppelt would join the Air Force flying saucer investigations. He started as a skeptic, but still tried to remain agnostic with UFOs as more and more anomalous cases came his way. Luckily for the Air Force, cases continued to fall, and the public's interest in UFOs continued to decline. This would change in 1952, when the number of sightings jumped from 10 a month to 70 a month. And in response, the Air Force reorganized their flying saucer investigations again, creating Project Blue Book in March of 1952. Run by Captain Ruppelt, who was now becoming more and more perplexed by UFOs. As 1952 continued, the increased sightings continued, and the UFO issue was becoming larger and more difficult to contain. And this growing problem would finally reach a boiling point in July of 1952, with the UFO wave over DC. For 2 consecutive weekends in July of 1952, UFOs were reported flying around the Washington, D.C. airspace. These UFOs were viewed by hundreds of witnesses and outmaneuvered our fastest jets that had been dispatched to intercept. Since this UFO wave occurred over the nation's capital, it caused a media frenzy, and as a result of the commotion, the D.C. phone lines were clogged. The location and the amount of press generated was a nightmare for the Air Force, and the UFO issue could no longer be brushed aside. Major General John Samford was forced to give the Department of Defense's largest press conference since World War II because of the UFO wave over DC. A huge step from the ghostwritten articles and the Saturday Evening Post. General Samford downplayed the sightings, but in face of all the credible witness testimony, he had to concede the following.
Of this great mass of reports, we have been able adequately to explain the great bulk of them, explain them to our own satisfaction. We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberrations. However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we now are attempting to resolve. Our basic difficulty in dealing with these is that there is no measurement of them that makes it possible for us to put them in any pattern that would be profitable for a deliberate, custom sort of analysis to take the next step. We have, as of date, come to only one firm conclusion with respect to this remaining percentage, and that is that it does not contain any pattern of purpose or of consistency that we can relate with to any conceivable threat to the United States.
The Air Force would explain these sightings as temperature inversions causing blips on radar, despite the testimonies from the dispatch pilots and radar operators from two separate DC airports. The public's faith in institutions was still high, and the temperature inversion explanation was widely accepted. But this UFO issue still needed to be seriously addressed. Behind the scenes, President Truman was demanding action, and memorandums began circulating in the CIA about the flying saucer issue. At the direction of President Truman, the CIA convened the Robertson Panel in January of 1953. The Robertson Panel, named after Chairman H.P. Robertson, was a panel of scientists and government officials tasked with assessing Project Blue Book and the UFO issue. The panel members were hand-selected by the CIA. They all had ties to the military and intelligence. Some had worked at MIT's Rad Lab, and some on the Manhattan Project, but all had predispositions of debunking flying saucers. To Edward Ruppelt and the Project Blue Book staff, the Robertson Panel was seen with uncertainty, but they hoped that the results of the panel would be a serious addressal of the UFO issue for the American people and the world. Their hope would be misplaced, however. Dr. Thornton Page was a member of the Robertson Panel, and he would remain a lifelong debunker. Later in life, he would say, quote, H.P. Robertson told us in the first private, no outsiders session that our job was to reduce public concern and show that UFO reports could be explained by conventional reasoning. It didn't matter what Edward Ruppelt and Project Blue Book would present. The Robertson Panel's conclusions were already made in advance. Nevertheless, Edward Ruppelt and members of Project Blue Book presented their UFO findings to the Robertson Panel. Over the course of 4 days, the Blue Book staff showed their best cases, but the panel members would quickly debunk them without much thought. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who is now the lead scientific advisor for Project Blue Book, was present at the Robertson Panel meetings. Here he is discussing how the panel reviewed the Blue Book cases.
There were two films that were of particular interest to the panel at that time. One was a film taken by a Navy officer while on vacation in Utah, near Tremonton, Utah, and the other was a film taken in Great Falls, Montana, by the owner of the local baseball team. The Utah film had already been subjected to some 1,000 or so man-hours of analysis by the Navy's Photographic Interpretation Laboratory. So the panel got up from their chairs and crouched around the wall to examine the films, and they asked to have the films run several times, as a matter of fact. Now, the Navy had, on the basis of their detailed analysis of the Utah films, they had concluded that the objects shown in the films could not be birds, balloons, aircraft, and so forth, but indeed that they were self-luminous, unidentified objects. Despite this conclusion, the panel rejected it and concluded that the objects were birds. They couldn't be unidentified, therefore they had to be birds. I came away from the meeting and from the room with the distinct feeling, however, that the panel had deliberately moved to debunk the whole subject and not to give it the serious scientific attention which it deserved.
And after all of the days of deliberation were finished, the Robertson Panel would quickly assemble a report with recommendations on how to address the flying saucers. Select documents from the panel's report have been declassified, and the conclusions read, pursuant to the request of the Assistant Director for Scientific Intelligence, the undersigned panel of scientific consultants has met to evaluate any possible threat to national security posed by unidentified flying objects, flying saucers, and to make recommendations thereon. The panel has received the evidence as presented by cognizant intelligence agencies, primarily the Air Technical Intelligence Center, and has reviewed a selection of the best documented incidents. As a result of its considerations, the panel concludes that the evidence presented on unidentified flying objects shows no indication that these phenomena constitute a direct physical threat to national security. We firmly believe that there is no residuum of cases which indicates phenomena which are attributable to foreign artifacts capable of hostile acts, and that there is no evidence that the phenomena indicates a need for the revision of current scientific concepts. The panel further concludes that the continued emphasis on the reporting of these phenomena does, in these parlous times, result in a threat to the orderly functioning of the protective organs of the body politique. We cite as examples the clogging of channels of communication by irrelevant reports, the danger of being led by continued false alarms to ignore real indications of hostile action, and the cultivation of a morbid national psychology in which skillful hostile propaganda could induce hysterical behavior and harmful distrust of duty-constituted authority. In order most effectively to strengthen the national facilities for the timely recognition and the appropriate handling of true indications of hostile action, and to minimize the concomitant dangers alluded to above, the panel recommends that the national security agencies take immediate steps to strip the unidentified flying objects of the special status they have been given and the aura of mystery they have unfortunately acquired, that the national security agencies institute policies on intelligence, training, and public education designed to prepare the material defenses and the morale of the country to recognize most promptly and to react most effectively to true indications of hostile intent or action. We suggest that these aims may be achieved by an integrated program designed to reassure the public of the total lack of evidence of inimical forces behind the phenomenon, and to train personnel to recognize and reject false indications quickly and effectively, and to strengthen regular channels for the evaluation of and prompt reaction to true indications of hostile measures. This document is linked in the description, and I highly recommend you read it in full. The panel stated that UFOs do not pose a threat to national security, but UFOs did pose a threat and that the hysteria caused by them could be used by a hostile foreign power. This being the height of the Cold War, the foreign power referenced was the Soviet Union.
Какая, так сказать, невинность, понимаете?
The Robertson panel is a very important moment in UFO history for us to understand. By connecting the UFO issue to something that the Soviet Union could weaponize, the CIA was now making the public's interest in UFOs a matter of national security in the ever-salient Cold War.
The crusade for freedom is your chance and mine to fight communism. Join now by sending your contributions to General Clay.
Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Are you a member of the Communist Party? Are you a member of the Communist Party?
To understand communism, its basic godless philosophy, its goal of world conquest, its insidious tactics, and its cunning strategy.
American Cold War propaganda was quite extensive, and the remnants of that intense messaging can still be felt today. And the American aversion to UFOs was cultivated by similar means. Although the Air Force was already in the business of secrecy and ridicule, the CIA had the expertise and ability to take that secrecy and ridicule far beyond a couple of magazine articles. During this time, the CIA was already in the business of influencing public opinion through psychological warfare and the media. The media and the intelligence agencies had developed a strong relationship in the post-war years, when the unified anti-Soviet vision of the Cold War motivated cooperation. There was a revolving door between the intelligence agencies and media corporations, and by the CIA's own admission, at least 25 organizations and 400 journalists were CIA assets during this time. The CIA had a healthy working relationship with many media outlets in the US, like the Associated Press, Time, and Newsweek. But the CIA's favorite media outlets were by far the New York Times and CBS. We can see this CIA media relationship later exposed at the 1975 Church Committee hearings.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces
two American journals. Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks? This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session. Have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI? Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole news and public affairs operation in 1954, ships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them. I think it was entirely in order for our correspondents at that time to make use of CIA agent chiefs of station and other members of the executive staff of CIA as sources of information which were useful in their assessments of world conditions.
A non-UFO example from this time, showing the CIA's proficiency at shaping public opinion through psychological warfare and media manipulation, can be found in Guatemala in 1954. The local government had just passed land reform bills that threatened the United Fruit Company's land holdings in Guatemala. In response, the CIA planned to covertly remove this government. CIA Director Alan Dulles called upon New York Times publisher Arthur Hayes Sulzberger to remove all critical foreign correspondence from Guatemala, to keep the American public in the dark. In country, the PSYOP and media manipulation was even more elaborate. Through a combination of fake newspapers, fake magazines, fake radio stations, and airdrops of leaflets, the CIA began bombarding the Guatemalan people with propaganda and disinformation. And through this small network of media outlets that they had created, the CIA was able to convince the Guatemalan government and people that a giant liberation army was winning victory after victory in the countryside, causing chaos and protests throughout Guatemala. The truth was, there was no liberation army, just a small group of Guatemalan exiles and American agents, totaling about 400 people. And through this elaborate web of misinformation and disinformation, they were able to immobilize the Guatemalan army and oust Jacobo Arbenz, the local leader. And when called out on these interventions at the United Nations, the United States denied any involvement, maintaining this position until the 1990s. Quick interesting fact about this is that during the planning period, the CIA even floated faking a UFO invasion when planning their psychological warfare campaign. Nevertheless, the CIA was successful in their psychological warfare campaign and controlling the narrative, resulting in a successful regime change abroad, and at home, resulting in most Americans believing that the events in Guatemala were spontaneous local uprisings, unaware of the invisible hand their country had played.
Peace comes to Guatemala. For the first time in 10 years, the people of Guatemala are breathing the sweet air of liberty. For United Fruit, it's business as usual, as all company land seized by the communists is returned.
So why are we covering Guatemala in a UFO video? Many reasons. The CIA's actions in Guatemala demonstrate their proficiency with psychological warfare and media manipulation in the 1950s. They faked an entire invasion, brainwashing millions of people, and immobilizing an entire army with only 400 personnel. It also demonstrates how the Cold War was a motivation for very extreme actions. Millions of lives would be affected because of the CIA coup, and that country would face instability for decades. But the Cold War justified these actions. If they did this for bananas, imagine what they would do for UFOs. The CIA in Guatemala also shows that governments lie, sometimes for decades. There would be no formal acknowledgement of US involvement in Guatemala until the 1990s. So keep these things in mind as we get back to UFOs, and keep in mind that the CIA was planning their Guatemalan psychological warfare campaign at the same time they were conducting the Robertson Panel. Back to UFOs. The CIA's Robertson Panel agreed that the government should take a more proactive approach by actively influencing public opinion on UFOs through the media. The Robertson Panel document contains a section titled Educational Program, that details some of the ways they plan to demystify UFOs. Quote, "The panel's concept of a broad educational program integrating efforts of all concerned agencies was that it should have two major aims: training and debunking. The training section discusses creating programs and films for identifying different phenomena like balloons, mirages, and clouds across different military and civilian groups. The debunking section is very interesting and goes into greater detail about their plans for UFO media manipulation. Quote, "The debunking aim would result in a reduction in public interest in flying saucers, which today evokes a strong psychological reaction. This education could be accomplished by mass media such as television, motion pictures, and popular articles. Basis of such education would be actual case histories, which had been puzzling at first, but later explained. As in the case of conjuring tricks, there is much less stimulation if the secret is known. Such a program should tend to reduce the current gullibility of the public and consequently their susceptibility to clever hostile propaganda." Panel members stated that many PhD-level psychologists should be contracted to best develop the educational program with the intended goals. And members of the panel suggested that the Jam Handy Company and Walt Disney Inc. could be used for films and cartoons dispelling UFOs, as both of these companies had worked with the government making World War II propaganda. The panel's report also outlines that civilian UFO groups should be closely monitored. Quote, "Unofficial investigating groups. The panel took cognizance of the existence of such groups as the Civilian Flying Saucer Investigators, Los Angeles, and the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, Wisconsin. It was believed that such organizations should be watched because of their potentially great influence on mass thinking if widespread sightings should occur. The apparent irresponsibility and the possible use of such groups for subversive purposes should be kept in mind." And within a few years, 49 different UFO groups throughout the country were being monitored, and some infiltrated. Even though the Air Force had a record of secrecy and ridicule regarding UFOs, producing a few debunking articles, the CIA was now establishing that a much more proactive approach was needed in changing public opinion against UFOs. It was now a matter of national security. Because of the CIA's Robertson panel, Project Blue Book became more of a debunking public relations firm than an actual investigation group, and the main goal was to reduce the public's interest in UFOs at all cost. Albert M. Chop, the head of the Blue Book press desk during this time, would say of the Robertson panel, "They, the CIA, killed the whole program. We've been ordered to work up a national debunking campaign, planting articles in magazines and arranging broadcasts to make UFO reports sound like poppycock." And Edward Ruppelt would say of the panel, "We're ordered to hide sightings when possible, but if a strong report does get out, we have to publish a fast explanation, make up something to kill the report in a hurry, and also ridicule the witness, especially if we can't figure out a plausible answer. We even have to discredit our own pilots. It's a raw deal, but we can't buck the CIA. The whole thing makes me sick. I'm thinking of putting in for inactive." And soon, the pro-UFO crowd of Project Blue Book would be replaced with Air Force officers who would toe the debunking line. Edward Ruppelt was replaced with Captain Charles Hardin, and of his replacement, Ruppelt would say, "Hardin thinks that anyone who is even interested in UFOs is crazy. They bore him." It should be noted that the CIA was actively denying any interest in UFOs, and Americans would be unaware of the official recommendations of the Robertson panel for decades. But behind the scenes, the goal was now clear: to debunk UFOs and make the public disinterested. And in the wake of the Robertson panel's recommendations, various changes to official UFO policy were made. Each of these changes was designed to control the UFO narrative and shape public opinion in their own way. Some increasing secrecy, some increasing ridicule, but when they all worked together, they would be most effective. Following the Robertson panel, we saw updates to JANAP 146, which made public reporting of UFO sightings by servicemen and some commercial pilots a federal crime under the Espionage Act, carrying the penalty of 1 to 10 years in prison or a $10,000 fine. JANAP 146 led to a few protests of commercial pilots, but these protests were only covered in local media, and the culture of pilots not reporting UFO sightings began. Air Force Regulation 200-2 that gave UFO investigative duties to the newly formed 4602nd Air Intelligence Squadron, a rapid response team with bases all over the country. And soon, the 4602nd was investigating more cases than Blue Book, unbeknownst to the public. Air Force Regulation 200-2 also mandated that only information about UFO cases that have been positively identified be shared with the press, drastically reducing the number of unknowns in the media. To help keep the number of unknowns low, trusted scientists would be given bigger platforms than ever before to reinforce the debunking line. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the chief scientific advisor for Project Blue Book, who was also present at the Robertson panel, would later discuss how he was instructed to lie to the press following the panel's conclusions.
A very prestigious panel. I was one of the lower ranking ones. They had Nobel Prize winners and whatnot on it. But at any rate, they handed down the dictum, which then became sort of the unwritten law of the Air Force. Don't rock the boat. Play it down. Cool it. Don't get the public excited.
Well, what is your answer to the people who are sure there are spaceships and they say that you and the Air Force are in cahoots? Well, first of all, this business about being in cahoots is just simply a downright falsehood.
And I know, having been in Blue Book for nearly 20 years, that whenever an interesting case came up, the very last thing in the world they would do is to notify the media. And when the media themselves found out something, the Air Force did its best to play it down. It's called it a balloon, called it a star, called it
balloons, meteors, satellites, aircraft seen with the sun glinting off of them, and birds.
Another prominent debunker for the Air Force was Dr. Donald Menzel, a distinguished Harvard University professor and the director of the Harvard Observatory, who had ties with naval intelligence.
First of all, the objects are not unidentified. We know what they are. Second, in most cases, they're not flying. And finally, in many cases, they are not even material objects.
Unlike Hynek, Menzel would maintain UFOs were nonsense until his death. An interesting fact about Menzel is that he had his own UFO sighting in 1949, while working as a military contractor at Holloman Air Force Base. Menzel's sighting had multiple witnesses and resulted in an official Air Force investigation. In his initial report, Menzel described orbs glowing white and green that vanished, and he described them as exceptional phenomena. Menzel would later go on to write multiple debunking books, becoming the first face of UFO skepticism. Menzel was also really close friends with New York Times writer Jonathan Leonard, claiming that through Leonard he had access to publish in the Times whenever he wanted. Hynek and Menzel, both being famous scientists in their own right separate of UFOs, would have a lot of influence on public opinion and academia. This was the height of the space race, and these astronomers were heroes to many Americans. Menzel especially. He was the top space scientist at Harvard, one of the best universities in the world. These and other scientists the Air Force propped up would help reinforce the official stance on UFOs, and dissuade academia from engaging the UFO topic. If Harvard's top astronomers saying UFOs are nonsense, they must be nonsense. In 1955, the Air Force would release their only public report, with Blue Book Special Report 14, which stated only 3% of cases were unsolved. These numbers are highly disputed today, but at the time, this low number was widely reported. Also in the press release for Special Report 14, half of the page is spent announcing that the Air Force was developing the experimental vehicle, the Avro-Car. This military project originated in Canada, but was now being worked on in the US. The press release emphasized that the Avro-Car looks like a flying saucer, and even warned that the Avro-Car would probably be responsible for a lot of saucer sightings in the future. The problem is that the Avro-Car hovered at about 3 feet and had a maximum speed of 35 miles per hour. This was intentional deception by the Air Force, who knew that the Avro-Car could not fly like the alleged saucers do. Despite these limited capabilities, the Avro-Car started to be used to explain multiple flying saucer reports, and even today you see the Avro-Car used to explain the 50s saucer craze. We will now look at the Air Force policy on hoaxes. Following the Robertson panel, the Department of Defense would release a reply to an inquiry on hoax policy by saying, "As stated in the enclosed fact summary, it is contrary to our policy to identify hoaxes, in order to avoid embarrassing the innocent parties." A big change from the days of launching investigations for unknown movie directors claiming to have footage of flying saucers. Researcher Curt Collins highlights that during this time not a single person was charged or punished for hoaxing a UFO. This would create an environment where hoaxers had free rein, while military and commercial pilots' UFO encounters were muzzled. And soon, the average American would no longer hear about truly anomalous cases from credible witnesses in the papers, only hoaxers and cases easily explained away by trusted scientists. Another big shaper of public opinion at this time was when President Eisenhower came out in support of the Air Force's conclusions in 1954. President Eisenhower was extremely popular, as he was responsible for the invasion of Normandy and seen as a national hero to all Americans. His downplaying of UFOs and affirmation of the Air Force's conclusions would be the ultimate appeal to military authority and have a large impact on the American population. We will now look at two things that have circumstantial evidence of being part of the anti-UFO psyop. There is circumstantial evidence that after the Robertson panel, elements of the intelligence community began obfuscating flying saucers even further by being the driving force behind the rise of George Adamski and the contactee movement, and the creation of the tabloid paper, the National Enquirer. George Adamski was one of the first contactees of the 1950s. He claimed to be in contact with peaceful Nordic Venusians.
To whom you ask? I have, more or less on gestures and mental telepathy as it is known thought transfer.
And claimed to have genuine footage of UFOs that many investigators later deemed fake. The contactees of the 1950s would become some of the first religious UFO movements of the flying saucer era, and Adamski and others like him would gain thousands of followers during the 1950s. The claims of researchers like Philip Collins are that Adamski was not a CIA agent, but that he was promoted to obfuscate flying saucers and researchers to the American people. To the casual news consumer, Donald Keyhoe would now be conflated with George Adamski. Coincidentally, Adamski's first book was released in 1953, the same year as the Robertson panel, and that year he saw a surge in press coverage. Despite the message of his space brothers being eerily similar to communism, Adamski was given free rein to travel the country and spread his message as he wished, a true anomaly in McCarthy-era America.
Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Are you a member of the Communist Party?
Are you a member of the Communist Party?
Lastly, there is circumstantial evidence that the intelligence community and the Mafia are behind the rise of the National Enquirer, the nation's most popular tabloid. The allegation is that the Mafia and the CIA controlled the National Enquirer as a way to obfuscate media related to UFOs and other matters of interest. These claims are rooted in the Enquirer's founder, Generoso Pope Jr. His father, Generoso Pope Sr., was an Italian immigrant that would eventually purchase Il Progresso, the largest Italian-American newspaper in the country. Controlling Il Progresso gave the Pope family a lot of political power, and soon relationships were established with both the Italian-American Mafia and with Benito Mussolini, whom the popes had admired early on. The Pope family's influence was so significant that President Roosevelt personally asked Generoso Pope Sr. to help get Italian Americans to support America's entering of World War II, and in doing so, the popes established relationships with Washington. And after the war, Generoso Pope Sr. helped the CIA defeat communists in a post-war Italy. Many poor, hungry Italians were looking to communism as a way to rebuild Italy after the war. And at the request of the CIA, Generoso Pope Sr. would use Il Progresso to launch letter-writing campaigns. Millions of Italian Americans would write letters to their relatives in Italy, promoting democracy and trash-talking communism. Now to the son, Generoso Pope Jr. He grew up in this world, and his father instilled in him an understanding and appreciation of the power that came with owning Il Progresso. After graduating from MIT, Generoso Pope Jr. would briefly run Il Progresso before going to work for the CIA's Psychological Warfare Unit in 1950. President Truman personally wrote Generoso Pope Jr.'s recommendation letter for the CIA. Generoso Pope Jr. spent 2 years with the CIA's Psychological Warfare Unit, and immediately after leaving, he would buy the newspaper The New York Enquirer in 1952, the same year as the increased surge in UFO reports. And soon he changed the name from The New York Enquirer to The National Enquirer, and turned it into a tabloid running scandalous stories about Hollywood and celebrities. The Enquirer cost $75,000, and some of this money to purchase the Enquirer came from infamous mobster Frank Costello, with the agreement not to cover the Mafia, and it is alleged that the remaining funds came from the CIA. There is documented evidence that the CIA has created tabloids similar to the National Enquirer in foreign countries to obfuscate truth and spread disinformation, with Pope Jr. making the National Enquirer directly after leaving the CIA's Psychological Warfare Unit, and the fact Pope Jr. maintained a close relationship with Washington for decades despite running a tabloid. It is not a stretch to say that the CIA would be involved with the National Enquirer. Now let's bring it back to UFOs. Generoso Pope Jr. bought the paper after leaving the CIA in 1952, the same year as the increased UFO wave and DC flap. And according to researcher Terry Hansen, in 1953, the same year as the Robertson panel, the National Enquirer began covering UFO stories. By the end of 1953, the National Enquirer was the publication covering the most UFO stories of any media outlet in the US. Tame saucer stories would appear right next to scandalous alien sex stories. Many fake quotes and sensational stories that still circulate today in UFO lore were first sourced in the National Enquirer. And perhaps most scandalous of all, the National Enquirer would sometimes be the first American paper to publish some of ufology's favorite cases, like Dr. Bob Jacobs' UFO event at Vandenberg Air Force Base, where allegedly a UFO disabled a dummy warhead.
Toward the end of the flight, I was looking at Major Mann saying, "Pretty good stuff, huh, sir?" And suddenly he said, "Just watch this." And as I watched, the warhead, the dummy warhead, the chaff that was put out in front of it as a decoy to deflect the Russian anti-missile tracking radar, everything was flying along, and suddenly, in the same direction this stuff was flying at about 8,000 miles an hour, an object came into the frame, shot a beam of light at the warhead, flew up to the top, shot another beam of light at the warhead, flew around the direction it was flying, shot another beam of light at the warhead, flew down, shot another beam of light at the warhead, and flew out the same way it came in.
This was first reported in the National Enquirer. The first American paper to publish about the Colares UFO flap in Brazil was the National Enquirer. And the National Enquirer would even be the first paper to resurface the Roswell incident, publishing their story and interview with Jesse Marcel a few months before the completion of 1980's The Roswell Incident by Bill Moore, Charles Berlitz, and Stanton Friedman. Generoso Pope Jr. would take the Enquirer circulation from 20,000 units to about 750,000 units in a few short years, and the National Enquirer would become the first ever tabloid to be carried in every grocery store in America. Everyone has to shop for groceries. For millions of Americans that weren't actively seeking out UFO books and information, their main exposure to UFOs would be seeing the outlandish covers as they waited to pay for their groceries. Whether intentional or not, the National Enquirer began tainting the concept of UFOs for Americans in 1953. So let's review what we have covered. The ways the public's perceptions of UFOs have been intentionally shaped. From the beginning, the Air Force was secretive with their investigations. With Project Sign, internally, many hypotheses were considered, but publicly, it was common to positively identify flying saucer cases that remained unsolved. From the beginning, there was secrecy, deceit, and reliance on the public's faith in institutions. With the change from Project Sign to Project Grudge, we saw the first documented cases of the Air Force ghostwriting articles to influence public opinion. High-ranking Air Force personnel were stating that these saucers were all hoaxes and misidentifications, and the articles in Cosmopolitan incorporated ridicule from official sources. With Grudge, we also saw the introduction of flying saucers in the big screen. We saw the Air Force launch an investigation into the first flying saucer film, and we saw the Air Force refuse to work on other flying saucer films. Once cases surged in 1952, and after the wave over DC, we saw the largest press conference since World War II, reaffirming appeals to authority, and once again relying on high faith in institutions. After the wave in DC, the CIA and other agencies were growing more and more concerned, and they convened the Robertson panel. The Robertson panel stated that UFOs do not pose a threat, but the hysteria caused by them could be used by the Soviet Union, making the public's interest in UFOs a matter of national security. We saw that the CIA was proficient in psychological warfare and media manipulation during this time, and they mandated that demystifying UFOs become a top priority across the agencies. And in the wake of the Robertson panel, we saw many actions aimed at demystifying UFOs. JANAP 146 made reporting a UFO incident a federal crime with the Espionage Act, and now military and commercial pilot testimony would not appear in the papers. Air Force Regulation 200-2 secretively took investigative duties away from Project Blue Book and mandated that only positively identified cases were to be shared with the press. There was an increase in the use of trusted scientists to reinforce the Air Force's claims that there was nothing to UFOs. Project Blue Book Special Report 14 misrepresented the number of unknowns to 3%, when in reality it was 20%, and the 3% number was widely reported. Blue Book Report 14 also introduced the Avrocar to the media, a lax policy when dealing with UFO hoaxers that allowed them free rein. A rise in the coverage of contactees like George Adamski, his clearly fake photos, and his zealot following. And the creation of the National Enquirer tabloid, and their becoming the leader for coverage of UFO stories. Each of these changes was designed to control the UFO narrative and shape public opinion in their own way, some to increase secrecy and some to increase ridicule. But the goals of the Robertson panel would be truly achieved when these policies were working together. The CIA had the means to take the anti-UFO psyop even further through their media assets, especially the New York Times and CBS. And that's what we will cover in the next video, how the New York Times and CBS took the anti-UFO psyop and helped expose it to millions of Americans.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks? This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.